There is a kind of pain that makes no sound. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't demand to be heard or validated or seen. It simply withdraws quietly, almost invisibly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, not in anger, not in defeat, but in something far more complex than either of those words can hold. And if you've ever been that person, the one who goes completely silent when something hurts you, you already know exactly what I mean. You know what it feels like to have 1,000 words sitting right behind your teeth and still choose to say nothing. You know the strange exhaustion of carrying a full emotional storm inside your chest, while your face remains completely still. You know how it feels to be in a room full of people mid-conversation, and yet feel yourself slowly disappearing from it. This video is for you, not to fix you, not to tell you that you need to speak up more, or open up faster, or be more expressive, but to do something that perhaps very few people in your life have ever truly done: to sit with your silence, look at it carefully, and understand where it actually came from. Because here is what most people get wrong about silence. They think it means nothing is happening. They look at someone who goes quiet during conflict and they assume indifference, stubbornness, coldness, maybe even arrogance, but the truth, the psychological truth, is almost the complete opposite. The people who go most silent when they're hurting are often the ones feeling the most. They are not empty in those moments. They are overwhelmingly full. So full, in fact, that words stop working. So full that the only thing the nervous system knows how to do is close the gate and go inward. Silence, for these people, was never really a choice. It became a conclusion. And understanding how someone arrives at that conclusion, that quiet, invisible internal rule that says it's safer to stay silent than to speak, is one of the most important journeys you can take into the psychology of the human heart. Let's begin at the beginning. Long before the silence became a habit, there was a moment, usually not a single dramatic moment, but a series of smaller, quieter ones, when someone tried. They tried to explain. They tried to say, "This hurt me," or "I don't understand," or "That felt unfair." They reached out emotionally, the way all human beings naturally do, because connection is not a luxury, it is a biological need. We are wired to seek understanding from the people around us. It is written into our nervous systems from the moment we are born. But what they received in return was not understanding. Maybe their feelings were dismissed. "You're being too sensitive." Maybe their words were interrupted before they could finish. Maybe they were told they were overreacting, making things up, being dramatic. Maybe the person they opened up to took their vulnerability and used it against them, twisting their words, turning their pain into a debate, making them feel foolish for having felt anything at all. And here is where psychology enters, quietly but profoundly. The human brain is not just a thinking machine. It is, above all else, a learning machine. And one of the things it learns fastest is what is safe and what is not. Psychologists call this associative learning, the process by which the brain forms connections between experiences and outcomes. Touch a hot stove, feel pain, learn not to touch it again. It happens with physical danger, and it happens just as powerfully, sometimes even more powerfully, with emotional danger. So when a person reaches out emotionally again and again, and the result is pain, dismissal, misunderstanding, humiliation, rejection, the brain begins to build a quiet but firm association. Emotional expression leads to emotional harm, and once that association is formed, the nervous system starts protecting itself the same way it would from any perceived threat. It pulls back, it goes silent. Psychologists have a term for this pattern: emotional withdrawal, and it is far more common than most people realize. It is not a personality flaw. It is not immaturity. It is not passive aggression, though it is often mistaken for all three. Emotional withdrawal is a coping response, a deeply intelligent, deeply human response to an environment that once made emotional expression feel dangerous. But to truly understand it, we have to go somewhere most people would rather not go. We have to go back to childhood. Because for the vast majority of people who carry this pattern into adulthood, it didn't start in their last relationship or their most recent conflict. It started much earlier in the small, ordinary moments of childhood when they first learned whether or not their emotions were welcome in the world. Children are emotionally honest in a way adults rarely are. A child who is sad will cry. A child who is confused will ask. A child who feels hurt will go to the nearest trusted person and say, in their own small, imperfect words, "Something doesn't feel right." This is not weakness. This is emotional health in its purest, most natural form. But what happens next shapes everything. If that child's feelings are met with warmth and acknowledgement, "I hear you, that must have been hard, tell me more," they learn that emotions are safe to express. They learn that vulnerability leads to connection. They grow up with what psychologists call secure emotional attachment, a quiet, internal belief that their inner world is valid and that other people can be trusted with it. But if that same child is met repeatedly with responses like "Stop crying, you're fine, don't be so sensitive," there's nothing to be upset about, something very different begins to happen. Psychologists call this emotional invalidation, and its effects on a developing mind are slow, subtle, and profound. The child doesn't stop feeling. Children cannot simply stop feeling. Emotions are neurological events, not decisions. But they do stop showing. They learn to internalize what was previously expressed. They learn to manage the storm privately, to become fluent in a kind of emotional secrecy that, from the outside, can look remarkably like composure. And here is the part that breaks my heart every time I think about it. That child is praised for it. She's so mature for her age, he never makes a fuss. She handles things so well. The very coping mechanism that was born out of emotional neglect gets mistaken for emotional strength, and so it gets reinforced. The child learns not only that silence is safer, but that silence is valued, that the quieter they are about their pain, the more approval they receive. So they get better at it. Year after year, they refine the skill of disappearing emotionally while remaining physically present. They become fluent in the language of "I'm fine" when they are anything but, and by the time they reach adulthood, the silence is no longer a conscious strategy. It has become something automatic, neurological, wired. There is a concept in neuroscience called neural pathway consolidation. In simple terms, it means that the more often you respond to something in a particular way, the more deeply that response becomes embedded in the brain's circuitry. What begins as a deliberate choice gradually becomes a reflex, and for someone who spent years learning that silence was safer than speech, the silence eventually stops feeling like a choice at all. This is why, when you ask someone who withdraws emotionally, "Why didn't you just say something?" the honest answer, the one they may not even fully understand themselves, is, "I couldn't." Not wouldn't, couldn't. Because in those moments when tension rises, when conflict begins to surface, when emotions start pressing up against the edges of what feels safe, the nervous system doesn't pause to ask what. The mature thing to do here, it responds immediately, automatically, the way it was trained to respond across years and years of quiet emotional survival. Psychologists and trauma researchers sometimes refer to this as the freeze response, a lesser, known cousin of the famous fight or flight reaction. When the brain perceives a situation as emotionally threatening, it can trigger a temporary shutdown of expressive function. Speech slows, the throat tightens, the mind paradoxically goes blank, not because there's nothing to say, but because there is too much to say and no safe pathway to say it through. And in that frozen silence, the person is not being cold. They are not being distant on purpose. They are, in the most fundamental sense, trying to survive an emotional moment their nervous system has categorized as dangerous. That is the truth beneath the quiet. That is what most people never see, and what the silent person themselves may have never had the language to explain. But there is more to this story, much more, because silence over time doesn't just become a reaction. It becomes an entire inner world, rich, complex, and deeply private, that the person learns to inhabit completely alone. And what happens inside that world, and what it costs them to live there, is something we need to talk about very carefully, because when silence becomes a home, it is the quietest kind of lonely. There is, imagine a well, deep, old, carved slowly out of stone over many years. On the surface, it looks still, calm, unbothered by wind or weather. But underneath, the water is constantly moving, shifting, collecting, rising. Nobody sees it, nobody thinks to look, and so the well just holds everything, quietly, indefinitely. Until one day, without warning, it simply overflows. This is what happens inside people who process everything alone. Every unspoken hurt, every swallowed explanation, every moment of feeling misunderstood but saying nothing, it doesn't disappear. It settles, layers upon layers of unexpressed emotion, accumulating in a place no one else can reach. And the person carrying all of it learns to function around its weight so naturally that even they sometimes forget how heavy it has become. This is the hidden consequence of a life lived in emotional silence, not weakness, not dysfunction, but a kind of invisible exhaustion that comes from never truly being witnessed by another human being. From always being the one who understands everyone else, while quietly hoping, but never asking, for someone to understand them too. And yet, here is where everything begins to shift. Because if you are someone who carries this pattern, there is something I want you to hear very clearly. Your silence was not a failure. It was not a flaw written into your character. It was a solution, an incredibly intelligent, incredibly human solution to an environment that once made openness feel unsafe. You adapted. You protected yourself the only way you knew how, and for a long time, that protection was exactly what you needed. But you are not that child anymore, and the people around you today are not the same people who once made expression feel dangerous. That distinction, quiet but profound, is where healing begins, not in grand gestures, not in forced vulnerability or practiced speeches, but in one small, courageous moment of letting one true feeling exist outside of you, just one. And then, when the world meets that feeling with gentleness instead of judgment, letting there be another. If this resonated with you, know that you are not alone in your silence, and you never were. This channel exists for the quiet ones. Subscribe if this felt like home.